My name is David Trouton, and I compose music for theatre, mostly these days children's theatre. I like working in that genre and in the children's theatre sector because it gives me the opportunity to write music for shows that can be quite epic in its scope. Some of the stories that are told in children's theatre are the big ones. Greek myths, stories that have a lot of drama and action in them, and that gives me the opportunity to write music on that scale, which I enjoy. I did a degree in music. I studied music quite formally at O level and A level, where I grew up in Ireland, and then I did a university degree in music, which was quite an academic degree. And really it's only after I left university and got into the real world of work that I became confident enough to actually go up for jobs where I had to deliver and compose music for deadlines, which was a big learning curve in itself. Yes, well I think like a lot of composers, I find that if I was locked in a room on my own with a keyboard and asked to write a piece of music, I would sit and stare at the wall for an awful long time. And really when I started to collaborate with other art forms, initially with dancers, with theatre makers, that I found the inspiration to write music came very quickly. So yes, I like collaborating with other art forms. It gives you the motivation. It sets a lot of parameters within which you can write, and often it involves writing short snippets of music and gives you a structure to work to, and actually it gives you a very, very tight brief, and I find that very helpful. What I find about writing my approach to music is very intuitive, and the music I write is traditional in the sense that they're often tunes you can whistle. So I don't write in an abstract way. I like to think of music as being two different types of music. You've got your pure music and applied music, in the same way as you have pure and applied maths. And to that extent, what I do is very much applied music. My music is used to help tell a story. So I'm exploiting what's familiar to an audience. I'm exploiting the fact that they will have a huge vocabulary of different music that they've learnt from films and television and other theatre pieces they've seen. So I can exploit that in order to manipulate their emotions on the way through the story. So my music is about initiating an emotional response. And so when I sit down to tell a story with music, I've got a template to follow. So I would recommend sitting down maybe with a short story and looking at the shape of that story, and that will give you inspiration to begin composing. What I would often do with a theatre director is sit down with a script at a very early stage and talk through where the important elements of the story occur. Like most stories will lead to one climactic point. There might be one point in the story that you think is a turning point or a cliffhanger. Just as you would analyse in English literature, where the important significant parts of a story are. We'd sit down and discuss those, and I would maybe start by writing music for that significant moment. And I'll find then that piece of music, that little musical idea, it could be a melodic theme or it could be a sequence of chords, will then inform what I write for other parts of the story. Similarly, like in opera, where characters have their own theme or leitmotif, in theatre you can use a theme to go with a particular character, so that theme can follow that character through, and the theme can develop as the character develops. So those are all little ideas that are intrinsic in a story that you can bring into your music to help structure your music. Yeah, I think very much so, yeah. I'm very interested in science, and so I like to think there's a scientific element to my approach to making music, and there are fundamental things in the way we perceive sound, and that influences the type of music that I write. But also in other disciplines, I've worked a lot with dancers, sculptors, people working in other art forms, and I'm often inspired by their approach. For example, dancers are very hard-working, dedicated people. They like structure because they have to move to music. There are certain limitations that human movement sets up that might inspire the meter that you write music in, the speed of the music, how quickly or slowly it changes. Mm. So I find that working with other art forms is very inspirational. Well, very much so. I mean, often when I'm writing music for a play, if that play is set in a particular geographical place or a particular historical moment in time, one of the first things I'll do is I'll go and research that. So music from other countries might feature because of the nature of the play, and similarly historical periods might dictate how I want to write the music. But also, as a musician and somebody who's keen or obsessed with music, you're always listening to music from other cultures and other parts of the world, even from other eras, and that will subconsciously influence what you're doing. Mm. I found that at one stage in my musical career, becoming interested in African music and buying a drum and learning how to play it has impacted on my technique as a piano player, as well as the way I think of music. Very much so. Once music technology became freely available, it greatly changed the way I work. I wasn't ever very good at writing music down with a pencil on a stave, and when I composed music, I always did it at the piano. But when sequencing first came along, before we had audio recording, and I started to use sequencing software, not only did that inspire me with lots of ideas, but it also taught me a lot of things about musical structures, that they are quite mathematical and they can be quite rigid. And so yes, I compose on a computer a lot. Mm. I compose at the keyboard, I record stuff into the computer, and I find once I've written a line, that might inspire me to write a second part, or I'll put music together often in the way that pop music's generally put together. You might start with a rhythm track, which you just loop, and sequencers give you the opportunity to get a 1 or 2 bar loop and just repeat it, and then work out a bass line maybe over 4 or 8 bars that goes with that, and then you put a melody on top. It's a very straightforward and conventional way of writing music, but once you've got experience of doing that, you become more confident and you experiment with what it is you're looping and what size of structures you're working with within that. It's hard to say, because I did go through quite a formal musical training, and there's a lot of stuff I've learnt that I've probably forgotten that I've learnt and I take for granted. And so yeah, there can be a sense in which you get stuck in a rut working on a sequencer where you're only ever using little 1 and 2 bar loops, and that your music could become quite repetitive or stay in the same place. So I think there can be downsides to using it. But as long as you have a clear idea of what you want to achieve as you start, I can only see it as an advantage. Yes, and that's often an element for negotiation when you're in rehearsals for a theatre piece. There are times when music maybe takes over and is telling the story more than anything else. There are other times when you've got dialogue and action on stage where the music can't dominate. And that's something that you do learn from your mistakes in, I think. But you're very much so, that's one of the nice things about collaboration, is that you're negotiating where music sits. And sometimes if I have a very strong feeling that music has to lead a certain part in a play, I'll argue for that. And more often than not, directors and performers agree. But there are times when you have to compromise. I'm often arguing about musical structures. When a director will tell me, that's too long, or can we cut that there? And I'll say, but that's not a musical structure. You can't have 3 bars. You have to have 4 or 8. So yeah, it's up for negotiation, but I really enjoy that part of it, and a lot of it is to do with standing back, being willing to compromise, but also arguing the case if you think that the music is helping something that's not working in the drama. Absolutely, absolutely. A lot of directors tell me that they love technical rehearsals. That technical rehearsal is that 2 or 3 day period before a show opens when you eventually get it into a theatre. Mm-hmm. And there are so many technical elements that have to be worked out. The lighting, where actors are standing, sound cues, all sorts of stuff is only ever sorted out in the last few days before a show opens. Sometimes, even though there might be a script, sometimes you arrive at a point where you don't know how long a piece of music has to be, and so you have to be very flexible right up to the end, and that can inform the way you write the music. Sometimes I will write music in a very modular way. What I mean by that is maybe there will be themes and musical ideas that are only 2, 4 or 8 bars long, and not knowing how long that music has to be in the final production, I can leave those up for grabs until the last minute. So if I know what I'm doing and I've written in that modular way, I can sort out the actual structure, the number of repeats of a little piece of music right at the 11th hour. So it does affect the way that you write music. You have to be very flexible right up to the end. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to say, I think, because there are as many ways of writing music as there are people writing music. But one of the things one of the approaches I have to music is that music is just organising sound. Once you start making decisions and making choices about when you want a sound to start and stop, what pitch you want it to be at, etc., etc., you're starting to compose music. And therefore, when you have to make those decisions, you have to be organised. One of my early mistakes was not being organised enough, not being clear in my head what it was I was trying to do when I sat down to write a piece of music. You don't want a blank page where you've got that you've got to fill, and you've so many options you can't fill it. So it helps to narrow down your options, decide what instruments you want to play, for example, might be a very early decision that you make, and in theatre that's often made for you. There's often not a budget to have 3 or 4 musicians playing. Often it's just yourself, so you have to decide on instrumentation. Are you going to use the palette of musical sounds available through technology nowadays? Or are you going to restrict it to a piano? Or are you going to have one acoustic player? Once you've made that decision, other decisions you can make early on are where the music's set time-wise. Lots and lots of decisions you can make before you actually sit down to write it. But I would say, because music is about organising sound, get organised. Have a clear understanding of, set yourself little tasks. Don't say I'm going to sit down and write a piece of music. Say I'm going to sit down and come up with a thematic idea that I can expand into a piece of music. Or sit down and just be organised in the way you approach it. And I'm not an organised person generally in my life, but when I sit down to write a piece of music, I have to have clear parameters of what it is I'm doing, why I'm doing it. And that's another reason why I find it inspiring to work with other art forms, because a lot of those questions are answered for you.